The golden afternoon sun streamed through the high, arched windows of the Bristol Hotel in Warsaw, casting long, dusty beams of light across the plush velvet carpets. It was a time when the city was vibrant, alive with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones outside, but inside the grand lounge, an air of quiet, expensive elegance prevailed. The air smelled faintly of strong coffee, expensive cigars, and the sweet scent of pastries that sat untouched on silver trays. In the center of this opulent room stood the prize of the hotel, a massive, black Steinway grand piano that gleamed like a mirror under the crystal chandeliers. Sitting near the piano, holding court with a small group of admirers, was a young man named Julian. He was dressed in the finest fashion of the day, with a tailored coat that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and a silk cravat tied in an intricate knot at his neck. Julian was not just wealthy, he was famous. He was a pianist of great renown, known throughout the city for his lightning-fast fingers and his dramatic style. People traveled from miles around just to see him perform, and he knew it. He carried himself with a distinct air of arrogance, his chin held high, his eyes scanning the room as if he were a king surveying his kingdom. Julian was in the middle of a story, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He was laughing, a deep, confident sound as he described his recent performance at the Royal Theatre. His listeners, a mix of wealthy socialites and eager music students, nodded and hung on his every word. To them, Julian was the height of success. He had money, he had talent, and he had the admiration of everyone who mattered. As he spoke, he lifted a cup of coffee to his lips, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the attention. "You should have seen the crowd," Julian said, waving a hand dismissively. "They were weeping before I even finished the first movement. It is quite a burden, truly, to have such an effect on people." One of his companions, a younger man with eager eyes, leaned forward. "But surely, maestro, it is a gift, to be able to touch the soul so deeply?" Julian set his cup down with a soft clink and sighed dramatically. "It is a gift, yes. But it is also a curse. When one plays at the level I do, one becomes lonely. Who else can understand the struggle? Who else can comprehend the difficulty of what I do?" He looked around the room, his gaze critical. Most people are simple. They hear the notes, but they do not feel them. They do not understand the complexity. As Julian spoke, his eyes drifted away from his adoring fans and began to wander around the lounge. He was looking for something to amuse himself, something to break the boredom of endless praise. His gaze skipped over the well-dressed guests, the waiters in crisp uniforms, and the expensive furniture. Then it stopped. In the far corner of the room, almost hidden in the shadow of a large potted palm tree, sat a woman. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She was not dressed in the latest fashion. In fact, her coat looked a bit worn, the fabric thinning at the elbows, and her hands resting in her lap were rough and red, as if she spent many hours working in the cold. She was sitting alone, a small cup of tea on the table before her, staring quietly out the window at the busy street. Julian smirked. He pointed a finger in her direction, careful not to let her see. "Look over there," he whispered to his friends, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Do you see that woman? The one in the corner?" The group turned to look. A few of them chuckled quietly. "She looks like a grandmother waiting for a bus," one woman remarked, hiding a laugh behind her hand.
"Exactly,"
Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at her. She looks like she has never seen the inside of a concert hall, let alone a grand piano. She looks simple, a commoner." He turned back to his friends, his excitement building. The arrogance that usually stayed hidden beneath a polite veneer was bubbling to the surface. He felt a sudden urge to prove his superiority, not just as a musician but as a member of the upper class. He wanted to show the disconnect between the refined world he lived in and the ordinary world of people like the woman in the corner. "I bet you all," Julian said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That woman has no idea what real music sounds like. I bet if I put her in front of this piano, she wouldn't even know how to sit properly." "She does look very out of place here," the young student admitted. but surely everyone knows how to play a little bit? Even the simplest folk song." Julian laughed, a sharp barking sound. "My dear boy, you give the masses too much credit. There is a vast difference between tapping out a nursery rhyme and understanding art." He stood up, smoothing his coat. "I think we need a little entertainment. A test, if you will." His friends exchanged glances, some looking nervous, others excited by the prospect of a scene. "Julian, be careful," one of the women whispered, though she was smiling. "It might be rude." "It is not rude. It is an experiment," Julian corrected her, puffing out his chest. "I am going to invite her to play. If she refuses, we drink our coffee and move on. But if she accepts," he trailed off, letting the silence hang in the air. The implication was clear. He expected her to make a fool of herself. He expected her to stumble, to play badly, and to give him and his friends a good laugh at her expense. To him, she wasn't a person with feelings. She was a prop for his amusement. The lounge was buzzing with low conversations. The clinking of silverware and the soft music of a string quartet playing in the background. No one was paying attention to the rich young man or the quiet older woman. Julian began to walk across the room, his boots clicking rhythmically on the floor. He moved with a predator's grace, confident that he was the most important person in the building. As he approached her corner, the woman did not look up immediately. She continued to stare out the window, her face serene and unreadable. When Julian reached her table, he paused, towering over her small frame. He cleared his throat loudly to announce his presence. The woman started slightly and turned her head. Her eyes were a clear, pale blue, and when she looked up at him, there was no fear in them, no awe. She simply looked at him, waiting for him to speak. This lack of immediate reverence annoyed Julian. He was used to people fawning over him. "Good afternoon, madam," Julian said, his voice smooth and polished, but laced with mockery. "I hope you are enjoying your tea." The woman nodded slowly. "It is quite adequate, thank you." "And you, sir?" Julian ignored her question. He glanced back at his table where his friends were watching intently. He wanted to make sure they had a good view. He turned his attention back to the woman, plastering a fake, charming smile on his face. "My friends and I are having a debate about music," Julian lied smoothly. "You see, I am a pianist. That piano over there is my domain for the afternoon. And we were wondering, do you play?" The woman looked at the grand piano across the room, then back at Julian. She did not answer right away. She studied his face, as if she were trying to see beneath his handsome exterior and find the man underneath. There was a wisdom in her eyes that made Julian uncomfortable for a split second, but he pushed the feeling away. "I know what the keys are," she said finally. Her voice was soft, a little raspy, but steady. Julian let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "You know what the keys are? That is wonderful. That is very amusing." He leaned down, resting one hand on the back of her chair, invading her personal space. "Come now, don't be shy. I'd bet you know a tune or two. A simple dance? A folk song from the village?" He was baiting her, trying to get her to agree so the humiliation could begin. He wanted her to stand up in her old coat, walk to the expensive instrument, and fail. He wanted to prove to his friends that art was not for everyone, that it was reserved for the elite, for people like him. "Why don't you come over to the piano?" Julian urged, extending a hand toward her, palm up. It looked like an invitation, but it felt like a command. "Play for us. Just a little bit. If you play well, I will be the first to applaud you. But," he added with a wink that was not playful, "I suspect we might be in for a laugh." The woman looked at his hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she sighed a very small, almost tired sigh. She placed her own rough hands on the table and pushed herself up to a standing position. She was shorter than he was, fragile looking against his tall, robust frame. She brushed a stray hair away from her face. "If it pleases you," she said quietly. "Oh, it pleases me greatly," Julian said, his grin widening. He felt a surge of triumph. He had one. He had drawn her into his game. He turned and gestured for her to walk ahead of him, like a showman presenting a reluctant act. As they began to walk across the thick carpet toward the piano, the conversations in the room started to die down. People noticed the strange pair of the flamboyant rich young man and the modest elderly woman. Julian's friends at the central table were leaning forward, their eyes wide with anticipation. They whispered among themselves, placing imaginary bets on how badly she would play. The mood in the room shifted from sophisticated relaxation to a tense, cruel anticipation. Julian walked a step behind her, feeling powerful. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea that he was walking toward his own undoing. He only saw a woman in a worn coat, someone he could use for a quick laugh. As they reached the polished bench of the Steinway, Julian stepped to the side, sweeping his arm toward the keys with a flourish. "After you, madam," he said, bowing slightly. "Let us hear this music." The elderly woman walked toward the massive black instrument with a slow, measured pace. The carpet beneath her feet was thick and plush, swallowing the sound of her footsteps, so it felt as if she were gliding across the floor. She did not look left or right at the people staring at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano, as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. Behind her, Julian followed with a spring in his step. He was enjoying this moment immensely. He felt like a ringmaster leading a reluctant animal into the circus ring. The gap between his expensive, polished leather shoes and her worn, scuffed boots seemed to represent the vast distance between their two worlds. To Julian, this was not just about music. It was about reinforcing the natural order of things. He was the master of the stage, and she was just a spectator who had wandered too far into the spotlight. As they reached the center of the lounge, the low hum of conversations died away completely. Waiters stopped pouring coffee. The string quartet in the corner ceased their bowing, sensing that something else was about to happen. All eyes turned to the strange pair standing by the grand piano. Julian stepped around her, leaned casually against the side of the instrument. He crossed his arms over his chest, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He looked out at his friends, raising his eyebrows as if to say, "Watch this." His friends were grinning back, some holding their hands over their mouths to stifle giggles. They expected a comedy show? They expected her to struggle to find the right keys, to play a disjointed nursery rhyme, or perhaps to bash the keys with her fists in embarrassment. They were ready to laugh. "Please, go ahead," Julian said, his voice loud and clear, carrying across the room. He gestured toward the open keyboard. "Don't be shy. The piano is in excellent tune, though I suspect you won't notice the difference." A few people in the crowd let out short, sharp laughs. It was cruel laughter, the kind that comes from people who feel safe in their superiority. The woman did not respond to his taunt. She did not even look at him. She simply reached the bench and paused. She stood there for a moment, looking at the keys as if greeting an old friend. Then, with a slow and careful movement, she lifted her hands and smoothed the fabric of her skirt. She sat down on the bench. The bench was adjusted for someone of Julian's height, so it was too high for her. Her feet barely touched the brass pedal on the floor. Julian snorted quietly, seeing this. "Here," he said, stepping forward to reach for the knob to adjust the seat height. "Allow me to help the lady." But before he could touch the bench, she held up a hand. It was a small gesture, but it was firm. She shook her head slightly. She did not want his help. She shifted herself forward on the seat so she could reach the pedals better. Bracing her heels on the floor, Julian pulled his hand back, looking slightly annoyed that she had rejected his assistance. He stepped back to his previous position, leaning against the piano again. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "The audience is waiting." The lounge was packed now. People had gathered in a wide circle around the piano. The air felt heavy with anticipation. It felt tense, like the air just before a thunderstorm breaks. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first note. The silence stretched out, seconds ticking by. Julian began to tap his foot impatiently against the floor. "Perhaps she has forgotten how to start," he quipped. The crowd laughed again, but this time the laughter was a little more nervous. The woman's lack of fear was starting to make some of them feel uncomfortable. Then the woman moved. She reached out with both hands and placed her fingers on the keys. Her hands were rough and weathered, the skin spotted with age, the knuckles swollen. They looked like hands that had scrubbed floors and washed clothes for decades. They looked like the hands of a servant, not an artist. Julian looked at those hands with a sneer, convinced that such hands could only produce clumsiness. But the moment her fingertips touched the ivory, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a change in her posture. Her back straightened. Her shoulders dropped, relaxing completely. The tired, frail look vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of intense focus and calm authority. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Taking a deep breath in through her nose, Julian opened his mouth to make another sarcastic comment. But before he could speak, her hands moved. She did not play a single testing note. She did not play a simple melody. She brought her hands down in a sudden, powerful chord that rang out like a thunderclap in the quiet room. The sound was rich, deep, and resonant. It vibrated through the floorboards, through the walls, and into the chests of everyone standing there. The laughter in the room died instantly. Julian's mouth snapped shut. Before the echo of the first chord had even faded, her right hand sprang into action. It was a blur of motion. She played a cascade of notes, a rapid running stream of sound that was impossibly fast and precise. It was a scale, but not like the simple scales students practiced. This was music filled with fire. It rushed down the keyboard like a waterfall, then surged back up again, faster and louder. The people in the front row flinched, startled by the sudden energy. They looked at the woman's face, expecting to see strain, but there was none. She sat perfectly still, her body relaxed, only her forearms and fingers moving. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the distance. Seeing something the rest of them could not see, Julian pushed himself off the piano. He stood up straight, the smirk gone from his face. He knew this music. It was technically demanding, the kind of piece that separated the amateurs from the professionals. He looked down at her hands, watching the way her fingers curled and struck the keys. It was not the clumsy hitting of a beginner. It was the efficient, powerful touch of a master. She transitioned from the rapid runs into a melody that was harsh, driving, and rhythmic. The bass notes boomed like cannon fire, while the higher notes danced above them like lightning. It was a stormy, dramatic piece, full of anger and passion. The Steinway, which had been a quiet piece of furniture moments ago, was now roaring. The sound filled every corner of the high-ceilinged lounge. Julian's friends stopped giggling. One of the young women lowered her hand from her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The man who had made the bet earlier turned pale, realizing that he had been wrong. They exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The sheer volume and speed of the music commanded silence. Julian felt a cold bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. He looked around the room and saw that the dynamic had completely flipped. 5 minutes ago, he was the center of attention, the powerful figure in control. Now, he was invisible. Everyone was looking at the woman in the worn coat. She was the one commanding the room. He tried to compose himself. He crossed his arms again, tighter this time, and tried to adopt a look of critical judgment. She is just fast, he told himself. Asterisk. She is loud. But surely she will make a mistake. Surely she will lose the rhythm. Asterisk. But she didn't. Her timing was perfect. She played with a confidence that terrified him. She navigated complex sections of the music that required the left hand to jump huge distances across the keyboard while the right hand maintained a steady rhythm. She did it without a single error. She did it without even looking at her hands. The music shifted again. The storminess began to soften, turning into something more lyrical and singing. The deep, heavy chords gave way to delicate high notes that floated in the air like bubbles. She played with incredible softness now, barely touching the keys, drawing a whispering sound from the instrument. The contrast between the loud, crashing sections and the soft, gentle ones was breathtaking. Julian felt his stomach knot. He knew how hard this was. He was a good pianist, a technically trained pianist, but he knew that he could not play with this kind of emotional range. He played to show off, to impress people with his skill. This woman, she wasn't showing off. She was telling a story. She was pouring something raw and real into the music that made his own. Performances feel fake and hollow. The woman's face remained serene, but there was a glistening in her eyes, as if she were remembering something far away. She played a series of sad, descending notes that made the listeners feel a sudden pang of sorrow in their chests. It was the kind of music that made you think of lost loves, of old regrets, of the passage of time. Julian looked at his shoes. He felt small. He felt a burning sensation of shame rising in his cheeks. He remembered the cruel jokes he had made. He remembered calling her simple. He remembered betting money that she would fail. And now, as the beautiful, complex melody filled the room, he realized he was the only one in the room who didn't belong. The piece she was playing was by a composer known for his difficulty and depth. It was a piece that Julian himself had practiced for weeks and still wasn't satisfied with. And here she was, an elderly stranger in a cheap coat, playing it from memory, flawlessly. She wasn't reading any music. There was no sheet music on the stand. She knew it by heart, every note, every nuance. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. She wasn't just an old woman who knew a few tunes. She was a musician, a real one, better than him. The audience was no longer bored. They were leaning forward, mesmerized. Some had closed their eyes to listen better. Others were holding their breath, afraid to miss a single note. The cruelty had vanished, replaced by awe. Even the waiters had stopped working to listen. Julian wanted to stop her. He wanted to slam the lid of the piano shut and shout, "Enough," to make the embarrassment stop. But he couldn't move. He was frozen to the spot, trapped by the beauty of the music and the weight of his own mistake. He had challenged a master, and he was losing badly. The woman continued to play, her fingers dancing over the keys, oblivious to the young man standing next to her, who was slowly realizing that his world was about to be turned upside down. She was just getting started, and she had a lot more to say. The music did not stop. Instead of slowing down or fading away, the woman's hands seemed to gain even more strength. The initial shock of the loud opening chords had passed, but now the real work began. The notes were not just fast. They were heavy and meaningful, hitting the strings of the piano with a force that seemed to come from deep within her chest. Julian stood frozen, his arms still crossed tightly against his chest, but his fingers were digging into his elbows. He was trying desperately to hold on to his arrogance, trying to find a flaw in her performance. He watched her hands like a hawk. He looked for a hesitation, for a slip of the finger, for a moment where she might lose the rhythm. But there was nothing. Her technique was flawless. The way her wrists rose and fell, the way her fingers curled perfectly to strike the keys, it was textbook perfection. Yet, it was better than anything in a textbook. Because it was alive, she began a complex section of the music that required her left hand to play a constantly thumping rhythm while her right hand spun out a web of sparkling melodies. It was a technique often called the thumb method by the great composers, a way of stretching the hand to cover more ground. Julian knew this section well. He had struggled with it for months. He had practiced it until his fingers ached, and even then, his teacher had told him it sounded a bit mechanical, but for this woman, it seemed effortless. Her thumb moved under her palm with the smoothness of a gliding bird, connecting the notes without breaking the flow. The rhythm was steady as a heartbeat, driving the music forward like a carriage galloping down a cobblestone street. The sound filled the entire lounge, bouncing off the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. It was so loud and powerful that the glasses on the tables rattled slightly. The rich guests in the front rows were no longer looking at each other. They were staring at the piano. The socialites who had been whispering about her worn coat were now open-mouthed. The young student who had laughed at the idea of her playing looked pale. He unconsciously moved his own fingers against his leg, trying to mimic the impossible speed he was hearing, but he couldn't keep up. Julian felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He realized with a sinking feeling that he recognized the piece now. It was a Hungarian rhapsody, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for the piano. It was famous for its demanding jumps, its rapid changes in mood, and its need for incredible stamina. It was a piece that only the greatest virtuosos dared to play in public. And here was this woman, playing it in a hotel lobby as if she were humming a simple tune. As the music surged, the woman's expression changed. Her face, which had been calm and still, began to show emotion. Her eyes closed tighter, and her head tilted slightly to the side. It looked as if she were in a trance. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She was feeling them. She was remembering something. The music was telling a story of longing, of wild passion, of deep sorrow. Julian looked at the rough red skin of her hands again. He noticed the calluses on her fingertips. Calluses that usually came from hard labor, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, working in the cold. But now he realized something else. Those calluses were also the mark of a pianist. They were the sign of someone who had spent thousands of hours at the keyboard pressing the strings until the skin hardened. She wasn't just a laborer. She was a musician who had fallen on hard times. The shame burned hotter in Julian's cheeks. He had judged her by her coat. He had judged her by her age. He had judged her by her silence. And he had been wrong in every possible way. Suddenly, the music took a sharp turn. The fast, energetic rhythm broke off into a delicate, haunting melody. The room went deadly quiet. The notes were soft, whispering like a secret in the dark. The woman played with incredible tenderness. She barely touched the keys, drawing out a sound that was so pure it made people want to weep. It was in this quiet moment that Julian made his mistake. Desperate to regain some control over the situation, he decided to interrupt. He thought that if he could catch her off guard, if he could stop her now, he could pretend the whole thing was just a trick. He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward. He leaned in close to her ear, intending to tap her on the shoulder or whisper something sarcastic like, "That is quite enough, madam." He moved his hand toward her. But as he got close, the music seemed to create a barrier around her. It was as if an invisible wall of sound stopped him. The sheer beauty of the melody froze him in place. He saw a single tear slide down the woman's wrinkled cheek. It was a tear of total concentration, of emotion poured out through her fingers. To interrupt her now would not just be rude, it would be a crime. It would be like walking into a church and shouting during a prayer. Julian's hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. He couldn't do it. He couldn't break the spell. He slowly pulled his hand back and stepped away, defeated not by her words, but by her soul. He retreated back to his position against the piano, but he no longer looked confident. He looked like a scolded child. The delicate melody ended. And without warning, the woman's hands crashed back down into the fast, furious rhythm. The transition was shocking. It felt like being woken up from a dream by a splash of cold water. The music roared back to life, faster and more intense than before. Her fingers were flying now, a blur of motion that was almost impossible to follow with the naked eye. She was playing the Frisca, the final section of the Rhapsody. Known for its breakneck speed and dizzying scales, the sound was a torrent of notes, a flood of music that swept through the room. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Julian's friends were no longer looking at him. They had completely forgotten about him. Their eyes were glued to the woman's hands. They were witnessing something rare, a moment of true genius. They realized that the man they had admired, the rich and famous Julian, was a fraud compared to her. He played for applause. She played because she had to. The music was inside her, fighting to get out. The audience began to shift. The feeling in the room was no longer tense or awkward. It was electric. People were no longer holding their breath out of politeness. They were holding it because they were afraid to miss a single note. A few people in the back stood on their tiptoes to get a better look. The woman's feet worked the pedals like a machine. She used the sustain pedal to blend the notes together, creating a wash of sound, and then released it instantly to make the rhythm crisp and sharp. She controlled the piano like a master horse rider controls a wild stallion. The instrument was doing exactly what she wanted, roaring one moment and whispering the next. Julian watched her face. It was glistening with sweat now, her hair starting to come loose from its tight bun, but she didn't care. She wasn't performing for the crowd. She was somewhere else, in a memory, in a feeling. She was channeling a power that had nothing to do with money or status. It was raw, human talent. He looked down at his own manicured hands, hands that had never done a hard day's work in his life. He felt a sudden wave of jealousy. He had everything: money, fame, nice clothes, expensive lessons. But he didn't have this. He didn't have that fire. He realized then that all his training had made him a technician, a player of notes. But she was an artist. The music raced toward its climax. The tempo increased, the notes tumbling over one another in a chaotic, beautiful race to the end. The entire room seemed to vibrate. The energy was so high that Julian felt his heart pounding in his chest, not from exercise, but from the sheer force of the music. He felt small. He felt like a boy who had brought a toy sword to a real battle. The woman's hands leaped from the low end of the keyboard to the high end, spanning octaves in a single jump. She hit the final runs with a precision that was terrifying. It was a display of physical strength as much as musical skill. Julian knew how exhausted his arms would feel after playing something this demanding. But she showed no sign of fatigue. If anything, she seemed to be getting stronger as the music built to its final. Thundering chords, Julian closed his eyes for a second. He couldn't bear to watch the triumph in her face, because he knew it was his defeat. He had invited her here to mock her, and she had used the opportunity to destroy him without saying a single word. She had exposed him. The silence that would follow this music would be louder than any insult he could ever throw. The final chords of the Hungarian Rhapsody crashed through the lobby like a tidal wave hitting the shore. The woman's hands came down hard on the low bass notes, and then, in a flash, they shot up to the highest treble keys, striking the final note with a sharpness that pierced the air. She held it, her body leaning forward, pouring every last ounce of her energy into the vibration of the strings. The sound hung there, suspended in the dust motes, dancing in the sunlight, ringing out with a clarity that seemed to freeze time itself. Then silence. Not the polite, awkward silence of before, but a heavy, stunned silence that pressed against everyone's ears. The grand piano seemed to be breathing, the wood still trembling from the assault it had just endured. For perhaps 5 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire room had been knocked unconscious by the sheer force of what they had just heard. The woman sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys, her head bowed. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the only sign of the effort she had just exerted. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the ivory and placed them gently in her lap. She smoothed the fabric of her old skirt, took a deep breath, and sat up straight. The spell broke. A sound came from the back of the room, a gasp, followed quickly by the sharp staccato sound of applause. It wasn't the slow, polite clapping that usually followed a hotel performance. It was an explosion. Within moments, the entire lounge erupted. People jumped to their feet. Waiters dropped their towels to clap. The young man who had been so eager to mock her was now standing with his mouth open, his hands slapping together so hard it looked painful. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Brava!" cried another. But amid this thunder of praise, one person stood frozen. Julian. He had not moved a muscle. His hands were still hanging loosely at his sides, his face drained of all color. The applause washed over him like a cold wave, but he felt no warmth from it. He felt like a stone statue in a garden while a storm raged around him. He looked at the people cheering, and he realized with a sickening jolt that they were not cheering for him. They were not looking at him at all. They were looking at her. The humiliation he had intended for her had boomeranged back and struck him with 1,000 times the force. He felt small. He felt like a fraud. The expensive suit he was wearing suddenly felt like a costume, a disguise for a man who had no real substance. He looked at his own hands, the hands he had been so proud of, and they looked weak and pale compared to the raw power he had just witnessed. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn around, walk out of the hotel, and never come back. He wanted to vanish into the crowds on the street and disappear. But his feet felt like they were made of lead. He was rooted to the spot, forced to stand there and watch the woman he had tried to mock receive the adoration he thought belonged only to him. The woman slowly stood up from the piano bench. She turned to face the room. She did not take a bow with a flourish, nor did she raise her arms to acknowledge the applause. She simply stood there, looking out at the crowd with a calm, quiet dignity. She gave a small, humble nod, acknowledging their appreciation, but it was clear she was not performing for them. She had played for the music, not for the fame. The applause grew louder. Some people began to push forward, wanting to shake her hand, wanting to speak to her. They were desperate to know who she was. A wealthy man in a top hat pushed through the crowd, reaching out to take her hand, his face beaming with respect. "That was extraordinary," he exclaimed. "Who are you, madam? Where have you studied?" Julian watched this scene unfold with a sense of unreality. This was his world. These were his people. The man shouting praises was a duke who had hosted Julian at his palace just last week. Now that same man was looking at the woman in the worn coat with more awe than he had ever shown Julian. The woman smiled softly at the duke.
"Ow."
But she did not answer his question. She gently withdrew her hand and turned away from the approaching crowd. She did not want their questions. She did not want their titles. She seemed to simply want to leave. She took a step away from the piano, heading back toward the corner where she had been sitting. Julian realized he was blocking her path. He was standing between her and the exit. He knew he should step aside. He knew he should bow his head and let her pass. But his pride, which had been so badly battered, made him act strangely. He couldn't just let her walk away without acknowledging him. He needed to say something, anything, to try and salvage a shred of his dignity as she approached him. Julian straightened his back and tried to smooth his expression. He tried to look like the benevolent master again, the one who had allowed this to happen. He forced a stiff, uncomfortable smile onto his face. "That was surprisingly adequate," Julian stammered. His voice sounded weak and thin, barely audible over the noise of the room. "Technically proficient, of course. You have strong fingers for a woman of your years." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Even as he said them, he knew how pathetic they sounded. It was like a child telling a lion that it was a big kitty. The woman stopped and looked at him. For the first time, she really looked him in the eye. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no triumph. There was only a deep, sad pity. It was the look someone gives a spoiled child who has thrown a tantrum and broken his favorite toy. She saw right through his expensive clothes and his arrogant posturing. She saw the insecure little boy underneath. "Music is not about fingers, young man," she said softly. Her voice rasped slightly, but it cut through the noise of the room, silencing the people nearby who were straining to hear. "It is not about technique. It is about the spirit. You have the tools, but you have lost the spirit. You play for yourself. That is why you are lonely." The words hit Julian harder than any physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. She had summed up his entire life in 3 sentences. She had exposed the emptiness he felt every time he walked off the stage. The way the applause never seemed to fill the hole inside him. He opened his mouth to reply, to argue, to defend himself, but no sound came out. He had no defense. He stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The woman didn't wait for a response. She stepped around him, continuing on her path. As she moved past him, she didn't even brush against his shoulder. It was as if he were a piece of furniture she had to navigate around. The crowd, seeing that the musician was leaving, parted to make a way for her. They watched her with reverence. No one was laughing at her clothes anymore. No one was whispering about her age. They saw only the greatness she possessed. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The cruelty that Julian had brought with him had been purged, replaced by a mixture of awe and collective shame. The guests looked at each other, suddenly feeling foolish for their earlier behavior. They realized they had almost mocked a master. Julian turned slowly to watch her go. He saw her return to the small table in the corner. She sat down in the same chair she had occupied before. She picked up her cup of tea, which was surely cold by now, and took a sip. She looked out the window again, the same simple, elderly woman she had been when she walked in. But now, to everyone in the room, she was a giant. Julian looked back at the piano. The lid was still open, the keys gleaming innocently under the chandelier lights. The piano looked like a dangerous beast that had finally been tamed. He realized he could never play that instrument the same way again. Every time he touched the keys, he would hear her ghost in the music. He would hear the sound of real passion, and he would know that he was only an imitator. His friends, the ones who had been laughing and placing bets, were now standing in a tight circle near the piano. They were talking in hushed, excited tones, completely ignoring Julian. They were debating who she could be: a forgotten countess, a retired professor. They were energized by the mystery of it. Julian tried to catch the eye of the young student, hoping for a supportive glance, but the student just turned away. Engrossed in a conversation with the Duke about the difficulties of Franz Liszt's compositions, Julian was alone. He was standing in a crowded room, surrounded by people, but he had never felt more isolated in his life. He looked at the woman in the corner one last time. She was finishing her tea, preparing to leave. He knew he should go over there. He knew he should apologize. He knew he should bow down and ask for her forgiveness. But his pride held him in place, locking his feet to the floor. The humiliation was complete. He had challenged the unknown, and the unknown had crushed him. He had sought to humiliate, and he had been the one stripped bare. The rich, famous pianist had been taught a lesson by a woman in a worn coat. And the lesson was this: true art cannot be bought, and it cannot be faked. Julian had spent his life trying to buy respect. Today, he learned that respect is something you have to earn, note by painful note. The applause eventually faded, but the energy in the room remained charged, like the air after a lightning strike. People were still buzzing, leaning over tables to whisper to one another, glancing repeatedly toward the corner where the woman sat. No one wanted to leave. They felt they had witnessed a miracle, a piece of history in the making. But the woman herself seemed untouched by the excitement. She simply finished her cold tea, placed a few copper coins on the table to pay for it, and stood up to leave. Julian watched her from the center of the room. He was still standing near the piano, feeling like a shipwrecked sailor, clinging to a rock. His heart was pounding, not from the excitement, but from a heavy, crushing weight of regret. He knew this was his moment. It was the only chance he had to salvage even a tiny piece of his honor. If he let her walk out that door without acknowledging her properly, without apologizing, he would be nothing more than a villain in a story that belonged to her. He took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move. It felt like walking through deep mud. Every step was a battle against his own ego. He walked across the lounge, ignoring his friends who were still arguing about the music. He walked past the Duke, who didn't even notice him. He walked straight to the corner. The woman had already picked up her worn handbag and was turning toward the exit. Julian intercepted her gently, stepping into her path but leaving a respectful distance between them. "Excuse me," Julian said. His voice was no longer loud or arrogant. It was quiet, almost trembling. "Please, wait." The woman stopped. She looked at him, her pale blue eyes calm and patient. She didn't look annoyed that he was blocking her way. She just waited. "I owe you an apology," Julian said. The words felt strange in his mouth, like stones he was forcing up his throat. He had not apologized for anything in years. "I was rude. I was cruel. I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He couldn't bring himself to say, "I thought you were a nobody." It sounded too terrible now. The woman's expression softened. She saw the young man's discomfort. She saw the way his shoulders were slumped, the way he refused to look her in the eye. She realized that his arrogance was a mask, and that she had just cracked it. "You were expecting a show," she said gently. "You wanted to amuse your friends? I understand. The world is full of people who judge the book by the cover." Julian looked up, shocked by her kindness. "But I insulted you. I tried to make a fool of you, and then you played. You played like an angel, like a master. Who are you, truly?" The woman smiled, a small, weary smile that touched the corners of her eyes. "I am just a woman who loved music once. A long time ago. I had the chance to study with the greats when I was young and full of fire. But life has a way of changing our paths. I lost my family, I lost my fortune, and I had to work. My hands were needed for labor, not for ivory keys. But the music never left me. It stayed inside, quiet for many years." She looked down at her rough red hands. I have not touched a piano in 10 years. Not until today. Your challenge, as arrogant as it was, gave me a gift. You reminded me of what I used to be. So, thank you." Julian felt tears stinging his eyes. He quickly looked away, blinking them back. He was humbled, not just by her talent, but by her forgiveness. She had turned his cruelty into a moment of grace. "I am a fool," Julian whispered. "I play every night. I play for applause, for money, for fame. But I don't have what you have. I lost the spirit of it a long time ago. I didn't even know it was gone until I heard you play today." The woman reached out and patted his arm. Her touch was light, but it carried the weight of wisdom. Talent is a lone young man. It is given to us to share, not to own. You have a gift, but you have buried it under your pride. If you want to be the artist you think you are, you must learn to play for the music, not for the people. You must play like you have nothing left to lose. With those final words, she squeezed his arm gently and then walked around him. She moved toward the heavy glass doors of the hotel entrance. Julian didn't try to stop her again. He stood there, watching her go. The hotel doorman held the door open for her, and for a second, the bright afternoon light silhouetted her figure. She looked like any other grandmother walking down the street, but to Julian, she was a giant. As the doors closed behind her, he felt a profound sense of loss, as if the sun had just gone down. He turned back to the room. The excitement was settling down. The Duke and his friends were gathering their things, getting ready to leave. Julian walked back toward the piano. The bench was still where she had left it. He sat down heavily, feeling the smooth velvet beneath his legs. He placed his hands on the keys. For the first time in his life, they felt like foreign objects. He tried to play a simple scale, the kind he had played 1,000 times since he was a child. But it sounded different. It sounded hollow. It sounded like noise. He stopped immediately. He remembered the storm she had created, the thunder and the whisper, the way she had made the piano sing and cry. He realized now that he had been painting by numbers while she was creating masterpieces. He knew he could never play that way again, unless he changed everything. The story of the event spread through Warsaw faster than the wind. By the next evening, everyone in high society was talking about it. But the story wasn't about Julian. It was about the mysterious woman in the worn coat. Some said she was a forgotten virtuoso from Paris. Others said she was a former student of the great Franz Liszt himself. People speculated about her identity in salons and drawing rooms for weeks. Julian's career changed that day, too. He didn't stop playing, but he was different. The arrogance was gone. He stopped making jokes about the audience. He stopped looking down on people who wore simple clothes. He began to play with a new depth, a new seriousness. He tried to find the emotion she had shown him, the spirit she spoke of. He practiced scales and technical exercises less. He spent more time just thinking about the music. Often. Late at night when the theater was empty, Julian would sit alone at his piano. He would close his eyes and try to imagine he was back in that hotel lobby. He would try to remember the sound of her hands striking the keys. He would play a melody, soft and slow, searching for the feeling of having nothing left to lose. He never saw the woman again. He walked the streets of the city sometimes, hoping to spot her silver hair or her worn coat. But she was gone. He didn't know her name, and he never found out where she lived. But in a way, she was with him every time he sat down to play. She was the ghost in his machine, the memory that kept him humble. The challenge he had made as a joke had turned out to be the most important lesson of his life. Years later, when Julian was an old man himself, he would tell the story to his own students. He would tell them about the rich, foolish pianist, and the mysterious woman who taught him a lesson in 5 minutes that a lifetime of lessons couldn't teach. He would tell them that true greatness has nothing to do with who you know, what you wear, or how much money you have. It has to do with what is in your heart. And sometimes, late at night, if the students listened very carefully, they would hear a sadness in the old man's playing, a respect for the unknown woman who had walked into a hotel, played a masterpiece and walked out, leaving a legend behind her. The piano was no longer a throne for a king. It was a place of truth. And finally, Julian knew how to speak the truth.